Okay. Well, hello again to everyone, and thanks for joining us today with Lighthouse Lab Services. Today, we'll be covering how to establish coding and get paid for new laboratory tests. So, thanks for joining us after the holiday weekend. We hope everyone had a chance to rest up and get ready for the summer here. I just want to quickly introduce myself. My name is Alex Mitchell. I'm a marketing communications manager for the Lighthouse Lab Services team. And I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers quickly. First off, we have Lena Chyhorsky joining us from Alva 10. Lena is the co-founder and vice president of payer innovation with Alva 10, and the company aims to restructure the relationship between health insurance payers and precision medicine diagnostic companies through their proprietary model MATE. Lena's background is in biology and mathematics from Tufts. She is a skilled healthcare executive with a proven track record of developing and executing value based reimbursement strategies for diagnostics companies. And she has extensive leadership experience in sales, national contracting, and all aspects of reimbursements within startup and global companies. Uh, Quickly like to also introduce Ann Lambrix, who's joined us for a number of these RCM related topics in the past. Ann is the VP of RCM Consulting for our RCM Solutions division, heading up the day to day operations. With more than 20 years in medical insurance and billing industry experience, Ann's background provides an insightful analysis of revenue cycle and payer trends impacting reimbursement. And she also holds an MSJ in health and hospital law. So again, thank you to both Anne and Lena for joining us today. Just quickly wanted to touch on some housekeeping items before we get started here. You can reduce your chance of lag or buffering by closing any bandwidth heavy apps you have running in the background. This webinar will be recorded and it will be sent out to the email address you registered with afterwards, so no need to ask for that if you're interested. Also, the slides are available to download under the handouts section, and we do have a little bit more information about Lighthouse in our RCM division if you're interested in that. And we also run polls during the webinar, and we're encouraging you to participate in those if you're interested, and if not, you can just exit out and move on. Also, we'll have a Q&A at the end as time allows. So feel free to go ahead and drop questions in the Q&A box, and we'll publish those and present them to Lena and Ann at the end. And now just quickly a little bit about Lighthouse. These events are free, and we do provide a number of services for the medical lab industry, and that's how we're able to keep them free. But we are the nation's leading and most trusted end-to-end full-service medical laboratory consulting and recruiting firm. Whether you're looking to start up a lab or grow your current business, we offer labs a way to accelerate their success. And as mentioned, we do offer a number of services surrounding RCM consulting, audit preparedness, various reviews. So if there's anything general in terms of RCM you're looking for, feel free to open that contact form and get in touch with us. We'll follow up after the meeting. But specifically, we'll have a form for Alva 10 later in this presentation. And if you're interested in discussing reimbursement for new lab tests, we highly encourage you to follow up with them. And now with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Ann.
Thanks, Alex. I am really excited about this presentation today. I'm really excited to hear Elena and Alva 10's discussion on the coding and development of potential reimbursement for new lab tests. When I was asked to put together some slides right away, as Alex said, we specialize in revenue cycle management solutions for clients, and we're often asked to help with new tests and identifying, mapping to CPT codes. What are the appropriate CPT codes? Should I go down the path of PLA? I thought, we have these labs that come in and say, I have a great new test and I want to start billing and I want to start getting paid. So tell me how to do that. And which is something that we can, again, help with. And I'm really excited to hear Lena's presentation. But I think what's important for us to really keep in mind is we have this great new test. We want to get a code. We want to get paid. And we look at the payer, the reality of the payer, they throw up their hands and kind of there's some question. Okay, so you have this great test, now what? So and we're going to talk about that a little bit today. So we think, we really need to rethink our approach, and make sure that we're aligning and evaluating our strategy, purposely when we're bringing new tests to market. Having the conversation with the payer, to avoid that question, versus waiting for denials. So being more proactive versus reactive, and making sure we're establishing that common ground with payers. What are the desired outcome for the payers' membership? And how does the lab support that, those desired outcomes with their test menu? And really, I think it's important to understand your value proposition to the payers. Um, Again, many labs think that because they have a test that has good science or has, backing from physicians and physicians are excited about it, that payers are going to respond favorably. And as we know, and I'm sure you all know, or many of you on the call know that that's not always the case. And so what we really want to discuss today, and Lena will be showcasing, is that new versus established tests, and really how to have those conversations with payers, and understanding again those different paths, CPT versus PLA, and how do we respond to that. So without further ado, Lena, if you want to go ahead and get us started.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. It's great to be with everybody today. Thanks for the introductions, and looking forward to talking you guys through this. I think, diagnostics reimbursement is one of the most contentious topics, I think, within the diagnostics industry. And it's interesting also how it's kind of contentious within the payer industry too. There's a lot of frustration, I think, as both industries have tried to communicate to each other over the years. So there's a couple, I think, key principles and lessons that can help you move forward in a constructive way when you're trying to tackle this topic. So next slide, please. I think the first thing that we'd like to do, from the perspective of kind of meeting everybody where they are, is really putting forward what I think is one of the biggest things to keep in mind when you're considering diagnostics reimbursement. Because usually when a conversation begins around diagnostics reimbursement, the conversation begins around coding. And that gives people the impression that unlocking coding unlocks diagnostics reimbursement. And that is completely and totally false. So I want to make sure that we are all on the same page here. And so just say this really clearly, that coding does not enable your test to get paid. It doesn't mean you're all set. The subject of diagnostics reimbursement is not simply a matter of getting the right code for your test. All coding does is it guarantees that when you submit that test to insurance, that claim will be processed by the insurance company's administrative systems. That does not mean that the result of that processing is going to result in a paid claim. Very often it's going to result in a not paid claim, because the heart of the matter is not coding, but coverage. And that actually leads us to our next slide.
Hey, Lena, if I could just interject, because
Sure.
I love this slide and this message. We had a call with Medicare. We were talking about MolDX, and we had the medical director on. And one of the points that I wrote down, and I try to hammer into my team's head and clients that come to us with these questions, is reimbursement doesn't equal coverage. And I think, like you said, many times we look at, there's an established CPT code with an established potentially fee on the fee schedule. And so the mindset is, because there's the code, because there's a fee, that means that there's going to be coverage. And like, to your point, it just means that we'll get through the payer system for processing. It doesn't mean it's going to be covered. It doesn't mean there's going to be policy that's going to deem medical necessity. And again, that's what we're really discussing today.
Yeah, definitely. And I wish we had this conversation more, honestly, in the lab industry, because I think that a lot of labs have gotten very confused and very frustrated by the diagnostics reimbursement process, because they feel like they're following, what the consultants and what everybody's saying is like reimbursement, what's your code? What's your code? And it really focuses the conversation on the code, and it really ignores coverage, which is the biggest and the holy grail of your entire reimbursement strategy. So with that, I wanted to put up this slide because I want to make a point here about who your various customers are and how important it is to build products for your ultimate customers. I think this is probably a sales cartoon that a lot of people know and understand, and you can look at this and you can say, okay, well, marketing requested a certain product, sales ordered something a little bit different, engineering designed something different, they scale manufactured something different, and then it was modified, and ultimately none of that was what the customer wanted. And I think in healthcare, the term customer is a little bit complicated, right? Because really we have two customers. I mean, we have three customers if we count the patient. But if you think about things, it's like, all right, well, the patient is kind of the person to whom everything happens, right? They're a customer in the sense that they're looking for an experience, but the experience they're looking for is probably to get better. They're not really dictating the course of events because they may not necessarily know what all the offerings are. And that's where healthcare administrators, like clinicians, come in to guide that process. And you may think, well, the clinician is my customer, right? I mean, if the clinician doesn't like my diagnostic test, they won't use it and I won't make any money. Well, that's true. If the clinician doesn't like the product that you made, they're not going to order it. But ordering a test is just half of you making money. The other side of that exchange is the insurance company actually paying for the test. And the insurance company paying for the test is just as critical as that clinician ordering the test, because if the clinician orders the test and now you run the test, right? Except now you're out money and you're waiting for the insurance company to reimburse you. You rely on that insurance company more than ever to make you whole as the manufacturer. And so what all this brings us to is the fact that the clinician is really the user, but it's the insurance company that is the economic customer of the diagnostics industry. The insurance company is who is buying your test, reimbursing you for the process of running that test. And so the customer, you really need to think about what insurance companies are looking for. Now, you may not know, and that's why there is us and why there's a whole variety of ways to engage with the payer industry, all of them critical. But the point I'm trying to make here is really a principle. And that principle is that we as the diagnostic industry have got to start looking at the insurance companies as our economic customers. As much as it may pain us to have that realization, if we are not building tools and products that are enabling insurance companies to meet their strategic goals, whatever they may be, then the chances that they are not going to reimburse our diagnostic tests are higher than ever. And so with that in mind, next slide, please. I wanted to kind of delineate the process of the US healthcare system as it relates to diagnostics into three main pillars. Coding is a pillar, but it's not the only one. There's really three pillars. There's coding, there's coverage, and there's reimbursement. And coding is doing nothing more and nothing less than just figuring out how to speak the language of the healthcare system. When you are running a diagnostic test, you are going to use the coding language to explain to the insurance company what procedure was run. And that insurance company is going to analyze that claim on the basis of that procedure. So that's just, is a payer going to recognize that me or my customer is asking to be reimbursed for the test that I created, the test that I ran? That's coding. Coverage is the holy grail of reimbursement, because coverage is really, is my test a covered benefit? When the insurance administrative processes see that I have filed this claim with this code, are they going to attach a $0 payment to that code, or are they going to attach something different? That is coverage. And then once you do have a covered benefit, now we can get into the process of, well, how much are they paying? If they're not paying zero, are they paying 10, 20, 100, 1,000, 3,000, 5,000? That is reimbursement. That is attaching a price to the coverage that you have obtained. And all three of these pillars work together, and all three of them are completely critical to commercial success. And hopefully laying it out in this way, you can see why you need all three, but two is not going to do it. You absolutely must have coverage for your test. Next slide, please. So this is a question that often comes up at this point, which is like, why is it so difficult to get coverage for diagnostics, right? Why did we just spend the time we spent kind of re-establishing this concept that coverage is so critical? And the reason that coverage is so critical, and I think the reason that it's evaded diagnostics for so long, is this concept of the vicious cycle in the diagnostics industry. And I think we as labs really have to understand this very well, because we have to understand when we do and don't contribute to it, and how we can not contribute to it. The truth is that the diagnostics industry communicates with the insurance industry very, very differently, and quite poorly as compared to the pharma industry. The diagnostic companies don't really think about insurance companies first. They think about insurance companies last, which is always a problem if you're thinking about your economic customer last. Usually what happens is a diagnostic company or a lab will develop a really promising biomarker or tool. Maybe they'll raise some funds, or they'll fund the clinical trial themselves. They'll obtain a CPT code, right? Just like they were told, get a code for your test. They'll submit an evidence dossier to insurance companies, and they'll say, okay, pay your balls in your court. I'm going to start running tests, and you have my dossier, you have my information, you've got my code, let's see you pay for that test. And the insurance company looks at this dossier, and they look at your test, and they look at the code, and they say, guys, we don't actually believe that this test is necessary. You haven't really proven to us that the use of this test is something that is critical for the care of this patient. And that if you use this test, the doctor is going to do something different than they would have. And that doing something different is going to result in a better outcome. You haven't proven clinical utility. You haven't proven a value proposition to us. And so we're going to call you experimental and investigational, or we're going to pay you a very, very small amount. And so then investors, or the lab operations department, will look at all of these claims that don't get paid, and they'll say, this test isn't a good investment. I don't know if I'm going to keep investing in it. And this cycle goes around and around and around. We've got diagnostics with incorrect utility, inadequate clinical evidence that lead to non-coverage, that lead to the test getting pulled from the market, that lead to less and less money into our space, because investors, outside investors or inside investors, can't figure out how to get a return on investment in diagnostics, because they can't figure out the coverage conundrum. And that's really where we have stepped in. 7 years ago, we started this company, and we innovated a business model that would fix this cycle, because we really see this as much more than just, the woes of the diagnostic industry. When you have a vicious cycle like this happening in the healthcare market, what's really happening is you are weakening the diagnostics industry. You are making it impossible for diagnostics to be what they need to be, which are the checks and balances of the entire healthcare system. Diagnostics are the GPS that you're supposed to use to chart your healthcare journey. They're the tests you're supposed to use to make the care more efficient, more optimized, more personalized. And if you don't have them, there's no real way to check and balance the therapeutics industry. And so the cost of care is going to keep going up and up and up, because we're practicing trial and fail medicine, right? We don't know what's going to work. So we have to try a bunch of stuff, because we don't have diagnostics to tell us the best course of action and the easiest and most linear way to get from point A to point B. So this is not just an issue for the diagnostics industry. This is an issue for healthcare. And so we started our company essentially to fix that. And the way we are going about fixing that, and I wanted to show this slide because I wanted to show you what we do. And we have a very specific process. Next slide, please. For doing this, but the principle of the process is what I just talked about, is really recognizing that the insurance company is the economic customer of the diagnostics industry. And so what we did was we actually went in and we just completely sort of redesigned the reimbursement system from the ground up. And we started a system where we work with insurance companies as strategic partners. We figure out what their problems are, what their unmet needs are from a clinical and an economic perspective. And then we work with pre-commercial diagnostic laboratories and pre-commercial companies and diagnostic laboratories to develop diagnostics and commercialize diagnostics that are solving those problems for the payers. It is incredible how much the problems of the payers and the problems of the clinicians align. Now, they may sound a little bit different, but really it's a lot of times it's both sides of the same coin, right? The insurance company is talking in economic terms and the clinician is talking in clinical terms, but it's really the same problem. And so what we have really done is we've designed a system that enables us to work with payers upfront to agree on the clinical utility. Let's agree on the product we're going to build, and let's agree on how much clinical evidence it's going to take for you to be sufficiently convinced that this is a test that has huge value and great clinical utility. So we agree on the unmet need, we agree on the evidence consensus, and we agree on the value-based reimbursement. We agree on the value of this test in the payer population. And when we first created this model, when we first started talking to our insurance company contacts, one of our contacts was a pharmacy director at a Blues plan. He looked back at the slide and said, "Oh my God, you guys are exactly right. Healthcare is totally confounding. In no other industry can the customer not give the supplier their vendor requirements." And that's actually exactly what this is. The insurance companies are economic customers, and they should be able to give the diagnostic industry their vendor requirements, but they've never been put in that position. They've never been asked to do that because there's never been a business model that has curated that conversation intelligently and capably from the perspective of both sides. And so that's essentially our business model, and that's how we operate. But this is a principle that I think, independent of our business model, is something that the diagnostic industry really needs to internalize, because without creating constant bridges of communication to the insurance industry, we are always going to be living in this very contentious relationship where we're constantly using codes to try to get diagnostics covered and paid for. But ultimately, that's not going to work because we never agree with our customer on the value of our product in the first place. So next slide, please. So at this point, I wanted to provide a little bit of an overview of how the reimbursement ecosystem works, right? Who are the players, who are the stakeholders, and what do they do for the three pillars? Because I think this helps people kind of chart their course more easily when they're trying to get their tests paid. So the three pillars on the left, right, we've got coding, coverage, and reimbursement. And there are different stakeholders that are responsible for these pillars. So for the coding pillar, the two organizations that are responsible are the American Medical Association, the AMA, and the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, which we casually call CMS in the US. So the AMA is the body whose job is to run and add to the coding system. They're like Webster. Their job is to make the dictionary. They're the ones that decide whether or not new words are added. They're the ones that constantly update the dictionary. That's the AMA. And CPT is actually a copyright of the AMA. CMS's job is to assign value to the codes that the AMA says this test or this procedure is now used widely enough, or it's a novel enough thing that it requires a new code. And then CMS says, okay, you've given me a new word in the dictionary, and now my job is to price it. And so we're going to talk about that part in a second, but we're first going to talk about the coverage pillar, which is essentially whether or not your test is going to be a covered benefit. Now, can you just flip to the next slide, please? Because I think some of this, yes. So the AMA establishes and maintains the code sets, and then CMS essentially sets what we're going to call the baseline value, because CMS decides the value, but then a whole bunch of commercial insurance companies come in and also decide the value. The point is that CMS sets the baseline value because for the most part, they decide first, and it's their decision that gets put in sort of this public clinical lab fee schedule that we all know. That's CMS pricing that goes in there. That's not Aetna or United pricing. So next slide, please. Okay, so the thing about coverage is that there are three organizations or three kind of bodies who make coverage decisions. And you can think about this from the perspective of how do Americans kind of sort themselves in terms of insurance, right? So for the purposes of insurance, we've got Americans who are 65 plus, right? These are people living in the US that are 65 years or older, and they fall under Medicare, right? If you get Medicare benefits, you're 65 plus or older, that's where you fall. There are people of indigent socioeconomic status who would qualify for Medicaid. Medicaid is a state-based thing. It's funded half by the states and half by the federal government, but every state Medicaid is different. So if you are a person who is under the age of 65 and you have a socioeconomic status that qualifies you for Medicaid, then Medicaid is essentially the insurance organization that decides whether or not your diagnostic test is reimbursable for that particular patient. And then you've got private insurance, right? You've got United, Aetna, the Blues, all those guys. They are all making decisions for the individual members, right? So they're making decisions for the companies who have accepted their bids and whose employees are now on the insurance of United, Aetna, or people who have purchased United, Aetna, et cetera, insurance through individual marketplaces. So you can see, right, there's Medicare, that's one body. There's Medicaid, that's 50 bodies. And then there's private insurance, which are all the, private insurance companies out there. So there's a lot of different organizations that make, if you want to say something like my test is perfectly covered in the US, well, that's a lot of organizations you're going to have to speak with, right? But you can see how they're categorized kind of into these three main bodies. And then from the reimbursement perspective, it's kind of the same thing, right? Whoever decides the coverage also decides the reimbursement. I've decided that I'm going to make your test a covered benefit for my Texas Medicaid population. I'm Texas Medicaid, and I also decide how much I'm going to pay for that. Now, this is where CMS's power really comes into play. Because CMS, as we said, they set the baseline value for all these AMA code sets, but that means they're also setting what they're going to pay for the entire Medicare population. So that's a huge power. The other thing is that payment amount, whatever they decide, also becomes like a reference amount for the state Medicaid fee schedules, because the state Medicaid fee schedules first look at the federal fee schedule set by CMS before they make their decisions. So that's a place where CMS obviously has enormous influence. And then the third place is that the commercial insurance companies also usually negotiate payment as a percentage of what CMS has decided the baseline value will be. So that baseline value, it's set in stone for Medicare patients, but as you can see, it's also highly referenced for Medicaid and for private insurance. Next slide, please. So let's jump into codes for a second, because I want to talk a little bit about, if we understand code, we understand coverage, we understand the concept of reimbursement, how much you get paid for your covered benefit. But what is all this about CPT codes and PLA codes, and what does all this mean? I wanted to just give you guys kind of a bird's eye view of codes in general, because I always think it helps to think about things in terms of categories. So you can think about codes in the US as a function of, is it happening in the inpatient setting or the outpatient setting? If something is happening in the inpatient setting, it is probably going under a DRG, a diagnosis related group. If something is happening in the outpatient setting, there are three different ways that can go. It can go under what's called an APC, an ambulatory payment classification. You can think of this as an outpatient DRG. It's like we lump some outpatient things into APCs because we're trying to sort of mirror the inpatient economics. You can think of it as something that gets paid on the physician fee schedule. So if a physician is running a procedure in their office, chances are it's going to get paid on the physician fee schedule. And that is a very complicated way of getting paid. The physician fee schedule, I would just mentally stamp this box like this is complex. There are multiple different elements to what makes up a physician fee schedule payment. And I'm just going to leave it there for the purposes of this conversation. The lab fee schedule is a lot simpler. The physician fee schedule is made up of like three different elements of a code, of what you get paid. But a lab fee schedule is just one lump sum. And there's basically two types of lab codes. There's a CPT code and there's a PLA code. CPT codes also have categories, but that's not really necessary for the purposes of this conversation. I think really when a diagnostic laboratory is looking at getting codes, they're trying to figure out CPT code or PLA code. So that's where we're going next. So next slide, please. So there's this sort of strategic decision point for diagnostics, right? Should I get a CPT code or a PLA code? So a diagnostic test can essentially get a CPT code in two different ways. The first is that it can jump onto an existing CPT code. Let's just say, for example, that you have created a test that is much more accurate than everything else out there, but it does the same thing, right? It's a Me Too test, for lack of a better term. It does something that insurance companies have already agreed is valuable and they already pay for it. So like finding an EGFR mutation by PCR, for example. So in that case, you can jump onto the CPT code that already exists. If you look at the laboratory fee schedule and you see, oh, here's a code, its descriptor matches exactly, what my test does, and I'm perfectly happy with this reimbursement rate, awesome. That's great for you. It means you essentially have a code that is hugely accurate to your test. The reimbursement rate matches, perfect. But let's say, for example, you have some sort of a twist on your assay, right? Let's say that you figured out a way to do it, but it requires a little bit of new technology or something else. So you can actually go and you can get a new CPT code from the AMA. You can say, my code is kind of like this code, but it's new enough and it's different enough technology that I want my own code. Okay, fair enough. You can definitely ask for that. There's a set of requirements, and the reason that the requirements are more stringent for CPT codes is because CPT codes can be used by a variety of tests, right? So the AMA wants to make sure that if we're adding a new word into the dictionary, it wasn't just like used 5 times, right, by some people. It's being used a lot, and it has like a colloquial understanding, et cetera, et cetera. I won't belabor the point, but I hope you see where I'm going. So essentially, the requirements to get a new CPT code for the AMA is that you need to have 3 peer-reviewed papers, and you have to have "quote unquote" widespread use by U.S. labs. Widespread use is obviously a very subjective term, but you need to prove that you're being used.
Lena, I was just going to ask, is widespread? Can you define widespread a little bit? Like, are we
No.
talking like, okay, there's
I've
not really
seen
any
it.
established criteria there?
I've seen it in so many different ways.
Mhm.
I've seen labs, prove like our test is used by hundreds of clinicians. Our test is used by, over 1,000 clinicians. I've also seen like our test is very reliably used by a handful of clinicians. But I think that that's why it's sort of a combination of things. They look at your peer-reviewed evidence. I don't think it's, to the best of my knowledge, there isn't a cutoff, right?
Okay.
Because there's no real way to prove a cutoff either. And they're not going to ask you for sales records or anything like that. Do you know what I mean? So I think they're looking for sufficient proof that your test is used outside of just your
Your
laboratory.
lab. Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Yeah. So the PLA code is a place where that actually doesn't really come up, because the PLA code system, and a PLA code, by the way, is also a form of CPT code, but we call it a PLA code so we don't confuse everybody. A PLA code is essentially the AMA's answer to the diagnostics industry's complaint of, wow, it's really hard to get a CPT code and it takes like 18 months. I have a new test and I want to be able to bill insurance companies, and you need to offer me a process that isn't, 18 months to 2 years long. And so for that, the AMA created the PLA code system. So the PLA code system has a lot less rigorous requirements. And you basically have to prove that the test is available for ordering by physicians, but you see the difference there, right? It basically just has to be on the market. You don't have to prove that the test actually needs to be used. And so that enables companies and diagnostic labs to get PLA codes for their tests a lot faster. We'll talk about the pros and cons in a second, but I just wanted to give you guys an understanding of, this is how you get a CPT code and this is how you get a PLA code. And the PLA code requirements are a lot less stringent than the CPT ones. So now we'll talk about the pros and cons. So essentially, the pros of a CPT code is that it's widely recognized by all payers. Every insurance company can process CPT codes. That's great, no problem. The PLA code system is recognized by Medicare and commercial payers, but the con is that Medicaid doesn't seem to recognize this code set. This is a little bit of a glitch in the system, to be honest. This is something that I have continuously heard people complain about. And I don't think it's something that Medicaid ever set out to do. It's not entirely clear why Medicaid has been having issues processing PLA code claims. But if your assay heavily relies on a Medicaid population, in other words, if it is intended for a Medicaid population, you really want to keep this in mind. In terms of the CPT codes, you always have these codes available to you, right? So for example, let's say you came out with a new assay, you're just in the initial stages of commercialization, and you're not ready to apply for a unique code, right? You just want to start getting your test out there. You want to start educating clinicians about it, and you want to give clinicians a way to get reimbursed for it if they can. Then there are generic CPT codes available out there that you can use. And I have to say, these codes, for obvious reasons, are sort of warily looked at by insurance companies, but the claims get processed. And so sometimes this is an easy way of, let's start getting our test on the market. We have every intention of getting a code. We want to get a code because we want to be able to announce ourselves in insurance claims. Like, we want to be able to show insurance companies that, yes, it is our test that was used, but we're not quite ready to do that yet. And so we just want to get the ball rolling. So it can be appropriate to bill under these generic codes. In the PLA system, or for example, you can use a CPT code, like I said, that's used by another Me Too test. Insurance companies won't know if it's your test or their test, but they'll reimburse you that amount, and that amount is good enough for you. And if that works, then that works. But sometimes you really want your test to be highly trackable. Your test is really novel. You want to get a value-based reimbursement rate for it. You want it to be valued. And so you really want your test to be trackable. And so that's the PLA code system. CPT code is like saying red truck, right? And PLA code is like saying, Toyota F-150. Like, it's specific to your test. It's specific to your lab or your manufacturer. There can be no mistake. No other red truck can bill a PLA code except for that Toyota F-150. And so essentially that's the way to ensure that you're highly trackable. And that can be a positive thing, but it can also be a negative thing if insurance companies don't agree with your clinical utility and they're not covering the test. And of course, pro or con, depending on the outcome, both of these code sets get priced at the annual Medicare June pricing meeting. So the reason I say it's a pro or con is you may want this, but you also need to understand that if you go get a PLA code, now you have submitted yourself to the administrative process, right? That means that Medicare is going to see that there's a new PLA code and they're going to price it during that June meeting. So you and your consultants and your strategy need to be ready to make a pricing argument to Medicare that June, because nothing is worse, and this happens so often, unfortunately, of the June pricing meeting, everybody's sitting there, Medicare is sitting there, Medicare is deliberating over code, and the manufacturer and the laboratory aren't there. And it's like, once you start going through this process, you can't drop it halfway. You have to go all the way through, or the value of your test is at stake. Next slide, please. So there's two different ways of pricing CPT codes and PLA codes, and those two methods are called crosswalking or gap filling. And you may have heard these two terms before, so I just wanted to define them really quickly. So crosswalking is the process of trying to convince Medicare that your test payment should be equal to or a multiplier of the payment of another Category 1 CPT code or PLA code, because essentially the components and the materials and the processes that make up the test that you're doing are sufficiently similar, or they're a multiplier of another code. So basically what you're saying is, here's a code that's pretty similar to mine, but I do 3 times as much stuff as they do, so I should be paid 3 times as much as they get paid. That's kind of a crosswalk. You're saying I'm similar enough to this thing. Sometimes you're saying I'm exactly similar to this thing, but you can also say I'm similar enough, but I want a multiplier. A gap fill is essentially the process of saying to Medicare, my test is so unique that there's no combination of codes that exist today that I can use to crosswalk to. So I'm asking for a gap fill. And a gap fill is essentially when you're telling Medicare, I want your administrative contractors, and we will talk about the MACs in a second, but basically, like, I want the people that the organizations that you hire to administer Medicare benefits across the country. I want those organizations to decide on the price of my code. And then you, federal Medicare, will take the median of that price. So what happens is you're basically asking for gap year, for lack of a better term. You're basically saying, I'm going to go and I'm going to talk to all these companies over the course of a year, and they're going to price my test. And then you, Medicare, we're all going to meet back here in a year, and you're going to take the median of all of those decisions. And sometimes labs look at this and they say, why on earth is this a good idea? This feels like a lot of work and a lot harder than crosswalking. And you're right, it is. But it can also be sometimes the shortest distance between 2 points. For example, if your test is already covered by the Medicare contractor in your area, then you perhaps may already be getting paid by them. And that's a good rate, right? And you don't want to necessarily give that rate up, to try and make an argument to federal Medicare and fail, let's just say. So you gap fill so that you essentially, you get your unique code, but you can keep getting paid by your Medicare contractor. And then that Medicare contractor's rate essentially it can be a huge influencer on the other Medicare contractors. So you can go to the other ones and you can say, guys, you don't really have to make a decision here because my Medicare contractor already pays me this much. Here's the argument for why you should write that number down too. And so, if the other contractors write that number down, Medicare looks at it and they say, great, I only see one number on this Excel spreadsheet. That's your price. Awesome. So in some cases, gap filling can be a lot easier, but usually the cases where it's easier is when you already have a relationship with your Medicare contractor. Which brings us to, so one more kind of side topic on the subject of CPTs and PLAs are ADLTs. And I don't know who here has heard of ADLTs, but I wanted to just really call them out because this is sort of a pricing strategy that is starting to become popular, but there are some things to be wary of. So an ADLT is essentially a test that meets one of the following criteria. It's called an advanced diagnostic laboratory test. Either the test meets all of the criterion in A, or the test is cleared or approved by the FDA. The whole purpose of ADLTs from the pricing perspective is that it enables labs to start charging Medicare their list price from day one. So it's kind of a bypass of the system, if you will, right? It's a way of saying, I don't want to do crosswalk or gap fill. It has to be, as you can tell, like to meet the criteria A, it has to be a really unique test, or it has to be an FDA approved test. But if it does meet all of criterion A or it's FDA approved, you can be an advanced diagnostic laboratory test, and then you have sort of earned the right to be able to bill Medicare your list amount from day one. But there's a huge catch to that. So next slide, please. The catch to that is that you can only bill Medicare your list price for the first 3 quarters that the test is on the market. After that, Medicare is going to pay the median that commercial payers paid for that code. So the catch is you can bill Medicare from day one, but you also need to tell Medicare what all the commercial payers are paying for your test. And then Medicare is going to take the median of all of those prices. And that is essentially how Medicare does a market correction. So the pros are if you've got a great billing team and you can chase down these commercial payers and you can get the reimbursement rate that you want from them, ADLT is a great way to go. But if you don't have a strong billing team, or if you don't have the resources behind you to get a strong billing team, you don't really want this because you're not gonna be able to keep up with the commercial payers, and you're not going to be able to make those arguments well. And then if they're not reimbursing the price that you want, you then have to turn around and you have to sell all that to Medicare. Medicare is going to look at this and say, wait a minute, you've been charging me all this money, but it turns out the commercial payers are barely paying you. I'm going to start barely paying you like they are. So this is kind of the pros and cons of ADLT. So as you can tell, companies and labs with scale, ADLTs can make a lot of sense. If you don't have a lot of resources behind you, or you don't have a lot of resources you're willing to invest in this strategy, might not be the strategy for you. I'm going to talk just a little bit about Medicare coverage and the MACs. That's kind of the last topic I wanted to hit on before we open it up for questions, because I think this is sort of the last big piece in the strategic puzzle, if you will. There are a couple different types of Medicare coverage. When people talk about coverage, coverage for Medicare is broken into national Medicare coverage, which is called an NCD, and a local Medicare coverage, which is called an LCD. So NCDs, there's two ways you can get an NCD. You can apply to Medicare and you can say, I'm here for an NCD, please put me under your NCD process, which is a big administrative process that starts. Or you can submit to something called CMS FDA Parallel Review, which is a program that not a lot of tests have gone through, but a couple have gone through them. Cologuard went through them, FMI went through them, and that's essentially when you apply for FDA approval and Medicare national coverage determination at the same time. Local coverage determination is managed by the MACs, and there's two ways of thinking about it. And we'll talk about MolDX and we'll talk about these jurisdictions in a second. But basically, what you have to understand is that in the Medicare space, there's 12 MACs. One of them is incredibly influential, and that program is called MolDX. And then there's essentially the non-MolDX jurisdictions. And so the question is really, what jurisdiction are you living in? This will become a lot clearer in a second. But basically, MolDX has a very, very stringent and known process for obtaining an LCD. So if you are in a MolDX jurisdiction, an LCD might be a really good option for you. But the other Medicare contractors are somewhat behind MolDX. This is changing a little bit, but their process is not as clear. And so asking for an LCD, if it's a non-MolDX jurisdiction, can be more difficult. And I'm going to show this next slide here, please. That's going to help explain the whole concept of MACs and jurisdictions. So next slide, please. Oh, here we go. So essentially, you'll have to think about Medicare as like the big boss, right? The federal government. And as we know, the federal government contracts out almost everything. And so they contract to private organizations. They do the same exact thing with Medicare. The federal government contracts out the administration of Medicare to commercial organizations called the MACs. Some of them are actually run by Blues plans. So if I'm not mistaken, Blue Cross Blue Shield of South Carolina, if I'm not mistaken, owns Palmetto, which is a Medicare contractor. So Medicare administers benefits in two ways. They essentially do Medicare Advantage, which is like, they basically pay United, one fee to manage a Medicare patient, and then United manages that patient. And then they have straight Medicare, which is essentially where they pay the MACs to administer it. So it's basically like, I'm not going to pay you one rate to manage the Medicare patient. I'm just going to pay all of the bills that the Medicare patient takes on, but you, MAC, are going to administer those payments for me. You're going to decide exactly how much to pay, etc. So there are 12 U.S. jurisdictions administered by 7 MACs, and this is the most updated MAC map, if you will. This is available on the Medicare website. So now things start to come into play, right? You can look at your state, you can figure out who your MAC is, and that's essentially the organization who's going to be making a decision on the Medicare coverage of your diagnostic test. Now, why is that? Because in the US, the physical location of the lab that processes all of the samples, that is what dictates what MAC reviews the test. So if your lab is based in California, Noridian, which is that contractor in California, it's their job to make a coverage determination for that diagnostic test. Now, the patient samples you may be running are patient samples from Arkansas, but it doesn't matter. You're running them in California. So it's not like you run a patient from Arkansas, you go to the Arkansas MAC and ask for coverage. You run a patient sample from Michigan, you go to the Michigan MAC and ask for coverage. If your lab is located, whatever state your lab is located, that is your one MAC, that is your go-to MAC for all of the diagnostic coverage conversations. And so this is where now I just want to say something about the MolDX program, because the MolDX program was essentially a project that was started in 2012 by which all of the molecular diagnostics started getting categorized and the coverage really started being analyzed. Like, how are we going to make decisions about which molecular diagnostic test to cover? So all of the Noridian and Palmetto jurisdictions historically use the MolDX program. So today that's 26 states. So if you are in a Noridian or a Palmetto jurisdiction, then chances are you are using the MolDX program. Now, there's a little bit of nuance to that. Noridian is, pulling a little bit away in some jurisdictions from the way that things used to be run. But generally speaking, this is still how it works. So it's considered kind of a positive thing to be in a jurisdiction that's run by the MolDX program, because the MolDX program is the most transparent way we have to understand how Medicare views molecular diagnostics. And so if you're in a MolDX jurisdiction, you're signing up for a more known and transparent process. The other MACs have struggled with molecular diagnostics. Some of them are in the process of hiring consultants to help them figure out the space, but you're just not dealing with people who have spent as much time really thinking about molecular diagnostics and their value. And so the chance that you're going to have a very smooth and successful relationship with that MAC over that diagnostic is a little bit less. And so that's also why companies will move their labs into MolDX jurisdictions. So if you're a company based in a certain state, but MolDX has a positive LCD for a diagnostic that's very similar to yours, for example, and you're trying to figure out where to start your lab up, it might be a really good idea to start it in a MolDX jurisdiction, because that's the way for you to completely legally and in a kosher way, but game the system in the sense that you're using this geographic rule to your advantage.
Lena, I also wanted to make sure, just for our audience, CGS and WPS are also MolDX MACs, and they may have maybe jurisdictions that don't subscribe to MolDX, but I just wanted to make sure we clarified Noridian, Palmetto, CGS, and WPS have the MolDX policies for.
Yes, there are 26 states today that are what are casually called MolDX states, and those states are available on the MolDX website. So if you Google, MolDX molecular diagnostics, MolDX will come up. And then there's an FAQ page. And the FAQ page, there's always a question, which states are MolDX states? And they are all listed and always updated. So one last note today, and then happy to open it up for questions or discussion, is just a note on LCD coverage timelines, because usually if you're trying to get Medicare coverage for your diagnostic, you're going to try to do it through an LCD. You're not going to try to do it through an NCD. An LCD process is about an 18-month process. These are basically the steps. You determine that you want, so you determine appropriate coding for your LCD, because that's important. Medicare accepts the application. They draft a local coverage determination. Then that draft gets posted online for a public comment period. Then that draft is addressed in a contractor advisory committee meeting called a CAC. The CAC approves the draft LCD or indicates changes. Then the new LCD opens up for a 45-day comment period, and then that new LCD becomes final. But this is not a guarantee that that MAC is going to write a positive LCD. This is just a guarantee that that MAC is going to make a decision. That decision might be negative. And if that decision is negative, chances are they won't even write an LCD. They'll just tell you, because they try not to write too many non-coverage LCDs. They try to reserve LCDs for what is covered. So this is the process. And if the MAC is covering your LCD, this is what you can expect from an administrative perspective, and it'll take about 9 to 18 months, usually 18 months, but if everything goes perfectly, you might be able to do it in 9. You technically can. But there are some real rate limiting steps. For example, the CAC only meets a couple times a year. You have to get on the agenda, nuances like that. But it's really important to keep in mind that, asking for an LCD doesn't mean you're going to get a positive coverage process. It's just you have to go through the process in order to engage with the MAC, because this is the process that determines whether or not Medicare will pay for your test as a covered benefit in whichever jurisdiction your lab is located. So I'm going to stop my kind of formal comments now. I hope this has been a helpful overview. I'm sure that there are questions that have been prompted, and my hope is that this has given you sort of an operational framework with which to think about this subject, both strategically and tactically. And I'm happy to take any questions or further conversation.
Yeah, thank
go
you,
ahead,
Lena.
Alex. I did have some questions if we can.
Yeah, I'll let you launch.
PLA.
Real quick, and I did
Yep.
just want to offer again, since we're running up on time here, we'll do a few minutes for Q&A. But if you are looking for any help getting reimbursement for a new lab test, please fill out that form right there. Someone from Alva 10 will contact you. And even if you just have general questions that you don't think we're going to have a chance to get to today, go ahead and fill out that form. Yeah, Anne, you can go ahead with maybe a question or two, and then we can take one or two from the audience as well.
Perfect. Thanks again, Lena. This was great. I did want to kind of go back to PLA versus CPT and a couple of questions that I had and wanted to get your thoughts. So with PLA, if I am a lab that wants to go the PLA route, one of the things that I've heard mention is that, PLA will be, accepted by Medicare, but the lab would have to go and establish acceptance, coverage / pricing with commercial payers and Medicaid. So just because Medicare says, yes, we'll pay for this test, here's your code, it doesn't mean that commercial payers will follow suit. You'll have to, the lab will have to do their due diligence in getting that pushed through with the various payers that they bill to other than Medicare. Is that correct?
Maybe rephrase it a little bit, Anne. I think you might have
gotten no, sorry. I'm sorry. I'm here. I was just on mute. I didn't realize I couldn't take myself off. I just did. So, Anne, understood the question. Basically, if you get coding and coverage from Medicare, that in no way guarantees that you will get coverage and reimbursement from commercial insurance companies. That is just Medicare. So if you get the code you want, if you get the reimbursement you want from Medicare, you still have to go knock on all of those commercial insurance company doors and say, hey, here's who I am, here's what my test does, here's the code, here's the decision Medicare made. And right. Here's where you have to understand your customer, because commercial insurance companies cover commercial patients. Whatever problem you're solving, if that's not, they may not be convinced that it's sufficiently a problem for the under 65 population, right? And so they may make a different decision. And so that's exactly right. And you need to always keep that in mind.
And part of that strategy is, again, exploring your payer mix. So, looking at the various payers that you would like to market this test to, and again, understanding that impact, going the path of CPT versus going the path of PLA.
And then to follow up on that, we actually have a question from Ian that asks, is it impossible to go to private insurance first? The slide shows private insurance as a negotiated payment amount as a percentage of the CMS baseline, but he's heard you can just go private first.
Yes, you can go private first. Private will usually ask where you are with Medicare. So you may just want to have an answer at the ready, unless your test is really only used on the less than 65 population. And then you can say, we're not really going to Medicare because that's not the population.
I think it's important to understand, as Lena had presented in her previous slides, Medicare typically sets the benchmark. So they establish the benchmark as far as reimbursement. And so commercial payers will look at that percentage of Medicare. So it's, again, making sure that there's a CPT code or a PLA code that the commercial payer can say, all right, we'll pay you this percentage of Medicare. And so it's not that you can't potentially go directly to commercial payers, but again, typically they're going to use Medicare as a benchmark.
Great. All right. Well, we do have a few questions we weren't able to get to, and I apologize for running so long, but we had great information from Lena and Anne. Thank you for your support as well. Just wanted to quickly mention that next month we will be looking at Audit preparedness, we've seen a number of increases in payer audits and take-back requests coinciding with the end of the public health emergency. Billing practices across the board got a little sloppy. So we are going to help with proactiveness and preparedness for what to do if you were to be selected for an audit. If that is of interest to you, feel free to click the registration button and sign up for that event, and you'll receive more notifications as they're available. Otherwise, thank you again for everyone to joining us today. Thanks, Anne and Lena, and we hope to see you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone.